are there specific prompts, questions, things you say to yourself that make for the best conversation?
This is the perfect question. Well done. So this is something that I learned about later that stems from a psychological concept called the Soloman paradox. And so the Soloman paradox, if you don't know who anyone's listening is, there was King Solomon, who was known for being wise, and he was one of the richest men of all time, etc. And so people, kings, rulers would come to him and ask for his advice. The reason that it's a paradox is that he gave exceptional advice to everyone else, but his actual life was in ruins. His son was a terrible son, and he had many wives, and he cheated, and he had this lust for money and all these things. But his advice to other people was amazing. And so the Soloman paradox, and it's been studied in multiple facets, that people give better advice than they follow themselves. And so they've studied this with relationships. They'll have somebody in a weird romantic relationship, tough setup, and they'll whitewash the names and say, hey, there's a lady, and she's getting beat by her husband once a month. And it's happened for 4 years. And this time she says that her husband says that it's not going to happen again. What do you think that woman should do? And then the person would give advice, and it completely conflicts with how that woman actually lives her life, even though she's giving advice to somebody who's not her, right? And they have postulated why this is. Now you could say you've removed the emotions from it, you've removed the tensions, whatever you want to say. But what we do know is that people give better advice than they follow. And so if you pair that concept with the idea that no one has more context on your life than you do, then you have a very powerful combo. And so one of the issues that I've had with like therapists and performance coaches and things like that is that I've done I would say maybe I've spent like 5, maybe 10 hours in total in a setting like that. I'm not very good at it. And it's because I usually feel like I'm spending the majority of my time trying to give them enough context in order to give me advice. Right? But they don't know every one of my skill sets. They don't know every one of my backgrounds. They don't know how that business deal, like he kind of looked a little dodgy, but I didn't have time to give more context to it so that they could give me the advice, right? And so I have failed at most of those things. And so when I tried this experiment, it was because I was actually really stressed about a decision. And so I said, okay, and this has been a mental practice of mine, was just talking to my 85-year-old self. But I was like, let me formalize this a little bit. And I'm actually going to write it out in a document. And so I started talking to my future self. And it was kind of interesting is I could hear myself laughing at myself. So like, I'm like, this thing isn't happening fast enough. Like, I don't know what's going on. And then I'd be like, what did you expect? You're trying to build $1 billion thing in what, a year? And then I'm like, well, I mean, no. And I'm like, well, what's the objective? And I'm asking the same questions I would ask a portfolio company or CEO, right? Or whatever. And I'm now getting coached by me. And some people might take that as like wildly egotistical, which hopefully they don't. But the other side of it is that like this person has 2 things that no therapist has. They have complete context on my situation, and they have completely aligned incentives. And there's no one else in the entire world who has that. And I would argue that most people know what they should do. They just don't do it. So I'll relate this back to weight loss sales way back in the day. I'd sit across the table from Sandy, and she'd be like, I don't know what to do. And I used to just like play into that, be like, oh yeah, well, I'll help you to educate and all that stuff. And as I got more and more experience with sales, I'd be like, sure you do. And they would look at me because they didn't expect that. And I'd be like, what do you mean? And that's also, it breaks the frame. And all of a sudden you actually get their attention. But I would say that, and they'd look at me cross-eyed, and I'd be like, if you had to lose weight, what would you do? And they were like, well, I'd work out more. I'm like, okay. I was like, what else would you do? And they're like, I'd probably eat a little better. I'm like, okay. I was like, pretty much got it. I was like, but that's not the issue, is it? And they're like, well, no. I was like, it's that you're not doing it. She was like, yeah. And I was like, I can help you with that. And so the issue is that a lot of times we think that we have a knowledge gap, but a lot of times it's not that we have a knowledge gap. We just need someone else to hold us accountable. And so the ultimate gift that I think you can give yourself in life is holding yourself accountable. Like if you can do that, if you can really hold yourself accountable, you can do anything. And so sometimes it's really hard to hold yourself accountable. And so I'm just asking my 85-year-old self to hold me accountable to what I say I want, right? Because even the flip side, and I said there's 2 things. There's the knowledge and then there's the incentive, right? Somebody might be able to help you out. but their incentives aren't aligned. So as terrible as what I'm about to say may sound, there are therapists that I think are very good and really help people. But there are also therapists that are human and have bills to pay and have families, and they look at their business like a business and have a recurring revenue stream and say, like, if I solve your problem, you won't leave. And so you come here and you vent to me and I say, let's do the same time next week. They're not trying to solve your problem. They're trying to make you feel better in the moment, but not solve it long term. And so I want someone who has complete context and completely aligned incentives. And there's only one person who has that, and that's me. And so the question is like, how can I give me advice? And it's like, well, me giving me advice isn't working. So I need old me to give advice who has 85 years of context. And the nice thing is that most of the time he just laughs at me and makes fun of me and tells me that none of this is going to matter. And so it's been a very nice razor for focusing on the few things that do. And so when I am stressed or I have a big business decision, I also know that I don't have to educate a therapist or a coach on at least my level of business acumen to get good advice. Right? And so that has been what I've called the Soloman Project. And so I have a recurring calendar meetup with myself for an hour on Mondays. It's the first thing I do. And I have a back and forth dialogue with 85-year-old me.